Welcome to Intended Consequences. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. And today, I'm joined by Karim Bardeesy. Karim is the co-founder and executive director of the Ryerson Leadership Lab at Ryerson University in Toronto. Karim was previously the Deputy Principal Secretary for the Premier of Ontario, the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, and served as Executive Director of Policy for Premiers Wynne and the Honourable Dalton McGuinty. He's worked as a journalist and editorial writer at the Globe and Mail and as an assistant at Slate Magazine. He holds a Master in Public Policy from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from McGill University. Karim, thanks for joining us today.
Good day, Mitch.
So obviously a very different time these days than maybe some of the conversations you and I would have had in the past, being both veterans of the Premier's office in Ontario and political staffers in Ontario politics. But now we've got a new challenge rather than the traditional public policy that would have hit us, which is the coronavirus or COVID-19. So I wanted to start in asking you a bit about your role in the Premier's office and how you think it would relate to a role like this. So neither of us dealt with something as serious or as rapidly changing as COVID-19, but as a former staffer and policy head in the Premier's office at a time like this, what do you think is the key to handling a response to COVID-19?
Yeah, and there's a couple really important things to do, and kudos to all the politicians and public servants and political staff who are managing this as best they can. I think it's fair to say that across partisanship, they are doing their best with very imperfect information and with no precedents to fall back on. And so I think that would be one of the first things, a realization about how different this is. And that means you have to be creative and you have to throw out some of your old rule books. There's some rule books that stay with you, like communicating directly, regularly, and as forthrightly as possible, as is true in any crisis communications situation. But even with that, you're seeing some innovations with that. You're seeing daily press conferences. You're seeing statements by ministers and first ministers that they don't have all the answers, promises that they might come back for more without knowing exactly what that more is yet. So you're already seeing, I think, some things in which, some respects in which people are treating this crisis differently than any other crisis they would have expected. The other major piece is really on the public policy side and trying to determine what tools are available and what things you have to do to help your constituents, the province or the entire country deal with the crisis. So what people on the inside would ordinarily be doing at a time like this, especially on the staff side, would be they'd be doing a number of things. They'd be looking at what formal powers they have already. What can we do now to help really get ahead of this? And you saw that at both the provincial and the federal level, using the Emergencies Act and the Quarantine Act and other pieces of legislation. And what you want to do and what politicians are trying to do is really understand what options they have available to them right away. Some of those, I mean, you can appreciate this. Some of those decisions are things that politicians would never in a million years think that they would want to employ. The idea of restricting gatherings to five people or less, except under exceptional circumstances. Mitch, you worked for Premier Ford. Can you imagine him having any world in which that was something that he thought was in general a good idea?
Yeah, well, the one I really liked was after Prime Minister Trudeau went out and changed the subsidy for workers from 10% income replacement to 75%, Premier Ford put out a tweet saying this was the right move. And so here you had a private businessman who believed that government was a bit too large and a bit too intrusive into people's lives saying, good job being large and intrusive, right? So it is a complete role reversal as to where you would traditionally stand, because in a time like this, you have to make sure that you're going above and beyond and doing exactly what is right. And that means it doesn't have to be partisan. So I think you're exactly right that you're looking back at certain playbooks and saying, can I use this over again? But you're also, having to make some big changes and things that you probably wouldn't be pretty comfortable doing in your regular sort of political prescription of the world.
Yeah. And can I just add to that? I think that explains why some journalists or some members of the public are frustrated with what they see as inaction or slow action. Some of these decisions are so consequential and so significant that you really do, even if there's a requirement to take them quickly, it really requires taking pause. I commend to all listeners of this podcast Angela Merkel's speech to the German people that she gave last week with respect to this crisis. And she repeatedly reminded people that this is a democracy and we need to do things in an open, transparent way. And we need to come together on these very, very difficult decisions, which she then had outlined or that were already underway. So again, just the gravity of the decisions that are being taken at a time like this, I wouldn't underestimate. And it speaks to a certain sobriety that I think all decision makers face, regardless of what the specific policy choice is or how it aligns with their ideology or not. It's the gravity and the extent of the power that they're deploying, which is really important to take into account right now.
Well, I think that brings us to an interesting point on the federal government's sort of immediate response package, as everybody's kind of suggested this is sort of step one, right? Where they've originally announced a 10% income replacement program. That's now been beefed up to 75% of a qualifying wage. They've closed the borders to non-essential travel. They've injected cash into the market in a variety of ways. They provided a bunch of different tax deferrals for businesses and families. But one of the things that everybody keeps talking about, and it's the Merkel example, is the speed. You've got to go fast. You've got to go fast. But you can only, as of right now, really to go fast, use the policy tools that are in the toolbox that are existing. Creating a new program right now, it's really difficult to do and to get that out in completely new ways. So knowing all of those limitations, you've got to go really fast, but there's only so many cars in your garage and they only go so fast. What do you make of the federal relief package so far?
I think it's getting better. The attendance to the financial sector as the first step was something that was a natural reaction by any finance minister, by any government that thinks it's a certain kind of situation they're dealing with. I think it became quickly clear that this was not a conventional recession in any way, and that the simple offering of credit is not going to be the way out and could in fact exacerbate things. I believe with some others that it's still too much tipped on the credit side rather than the relief side. Relief from credit is not as preferred as relief from expenses and income support. And overall, there's still more relief from debts and delay of payments than money coming in. That may change with the latest announcement around the 75% income support piece. So I think every announcement has gotten more encouraging from that respect to really attend to what are the big problems. This is not a financial crisis. This is not a finance-driven recession or depression that we'll be experiencing. This is a crisis of small business primarily and the social sector. And so it's encouraging to see more and more income supports going that way. I'm also hopeful that the government is starting to think about what the next stage is. There's really building a bridge, to use terms that Kevin Milligan and Jennifer Robson and others have used. Jennifer Robson referred to the measures being taken as putting the economy into a coma, the regulatory measures. So we need to give nutrients to the patient who's in the coma to be able to get to the next stage. So I'm hopeful that governments start entertaining discussions with various players in the economy around what this next stage is. That's another. I'll segue back to your earlier question. I think it's a really important thing to understand what's happening right now inside governments. There is likely a lot of outreach, a lot of give us your best ideas, a lot of we're going to need to get money to people quickly. Can you help us get that money to them? Because again, governments don't have all the tools to get money to people. And so hopefully as those conversations continue and iterate, you're going to start to see creative ideas around not just traditional bailouts to sectors, but supports to sectors that can really then do very well to get other supports into the hands of people.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some fascinating points there, right, about the fact that this really isn't financially driven in the traditional sense of sort of the 2008 recession. And so when you're dealing with something like that, there's a lot of desire and demand, like you said, both in this stage and in the next stage, to inject cash into people's pockets, into businesses' pockets, and into families' pockets. And obviously, that cash doesn't come for free; it comes with a real price tag. C.D. Howe put out, I think they put out a paper about an income replacement program at 55% before the Trudeau Liberals decided to do the 75% version. And they had that program, depending on who was eligible and all that kind of stuff, at anywhere between $5 and $7 billion a week. And now we've got a 75% income replacement program coming from the federal government. I mean, this could be a lot of money, creating some downstream problems about how much we're spending, but we might not have a choice but to spend it. So, how do you deal with that balance where you've got a pressure to spend through the teeth, but you also, as a government, you never really want to let go of that money? It really is a really unique situation right now for both the Premier and the Prime Minister and premiers across the province.
Yeah, and you would understand the public policy implications of even at the most generous terms, that debt needs to be paid back, and there's an intergenerational equity piece to that. I would just observe there's a thread that needs to be pulled on more here, which is there are a number of sectors and there are a number of Canadians in categories who are not being affected as much. Salaried workers in a number of sectors are doing okay. The finance sector is actually doing fine. I haven't seen any evidence of them making any concessions to their margins or their bottom lines, except for deferrals of credit of debt rather than any reductions in debt, which to me, doesn't yet appear to be a real hit to their bottom line. So I believe I believe it is a moral obligation, and we haven't yet heard this said as starkly by our first ministers. I believe it is a moral obligation that every player and sector in the economy has a contribution to make, and that can either be some of that needs to be taxed back if we're going to rely solely on government, or we're going to have to ask a lot of other sectors and a lot of other Canadians to do their share, to give money and to make concessions to their own bottom lines, because the people and the entities that are suffering are in many ways the lifeblood of our society and our economy, and we can't let them be losers while others be winners. And the them in this case is the majority of small businesses, the majority of Canadians. And so those entities that continue to do well by their privileged situations need to make a contribution. We haven't seen that yet, but we're going to have to start having that conversation.
Yeah, and I think to your point of sort of the moral suasion of the moral argument, you've seen, now to take it to the provincial government down to the sort of Ontario level, you've seen that government make some decisions that that perhaps were policy areas that they weren't going to delve into before. So, they've extended funding for crown wards of the state to go up to 21 years old instead of 18 years old for when they would normally age out of the system, as an understanding that you can't really age out of the system right now because you're not going to be able to have the funds to deal with that, or an economy to fall back on to find some sort of job placement. So there's lots of interesting things that are going on and policy changes that are happening rapidly. The provincial side has also put out a set of relief measures, similar in the sense that they have a lot of tax deferrals. They had some interesting new measures for rural and northern places to try to stimulate economic growth, perhaps more on the recovery side later on. And they also injected healthcare funds, knowing that that's their principal responsibility in the COVID crisis. So what's your evaluation of the Ontario government's response so far, knowing that you've got a lot of experience from your days there?
Yeah, and I would say that I was largely encouraged up to the fiscal update last week. A lot of the measures taken on the labor policy side, on the healthcare spending side, were the right ones in terms of protecting workers, in terms of and in general being quick to act to begin the physical distancing. I think the province's decision to close schools, their announcement to close schools was the most significant Canadian public policy announcement that really helped get other jurisdictions, including the federal government, in line to take this as seriously as it needed to be taken. That said, I was disappointed with the provincial update. It seems like they are not generally interested in the income replacement side in any great extent. Perhaps there needs to be better coordination with the federal government on questions like that, because provinces in general have not been that active in that space. But that is something that is a bit of a disappointment. I would also add that there are a number of other key social services sectors beyond healthcare that are going to need support, and social policy areas, including education, and including I think the government needs a bit clearer realization of how dependent so many young people are on the school system, the post-secondary system, and other systems, and that we didn't see support or any modification of any policies in that area yet. And I'm hopeful that the province will still get there. Again, conscious that provincial policymakers are dealing with an unprecedented situation.
Yeah, so I want to take those 2 points separately. The first one being about sort of provincial governments getting into the income replacement game. There's been a bit of an argument here that the federal government is best suited to take on the principal amount of debt and cost that comes with this crisis and this recovery. And so maybe they're doing it through the income replacement way. One of the other ways that that's been talked about is through transfers to the provinces. Do you think if the federal government were to sort of accelerate the way that it does transfers to the provinces or boost them temporarily, that would give the province a little bit more encouragement to go into the income replacement space?
I think so. I think that in an era of real-time policymaking, we need a bit more of those signals being made either clear in private or in public. And it's a reciprocal signal. So the province needs to send that signal that is receptive to and welcoming of that. There are some policymakers who are looking at sort of broader. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in the policy world, is there's going to be a broader conversation around federal, provincial spending arrangements and even equalization that this crisis is going to trigger. And so, yes, I think that is something that could have been done by the federal government, and maybe it still can be, in the areas of childcare and the areas of social assistance. Those are programs where there is a federal spending element of some kind, very indirect often, and those needs are going to those needs aren't going away, and they'll be exacerbated, especially if people who are dependent on those services aren't getting the relief from bill payments.
Right. And then on the second point you mentioned on sort of the need to consider the dramatic impact of closed institutions on youth and sort of social service side rather than just the financial side. I mean, you mentioned before the financial side going there first is sort of a natural reaction given our lessons from 2008, but this one's different. So how different does that stimulus when we do get to the spending side of this recovery rather than just sort of the immediate relief side of the recovery? How different does that stimulus look? Or do you think it actually shares a lot of characteristics with the 2008 stimulus packages we saw?
I believe it'll probably require the reconstruction of businesses, of way more businesses that have gone away. Thinking of your typical Main Street, you're from Oromodonte, right?
That's right, land of the free, home of the brave.
and I'm not from Ontario. I'm from northeastern New Brunswick, a town called Bathurst. And even with all the attention to both the income side and the deferral of expense side, we are already seeing businesses with signs in their windows that we worry are going to be the last signs that will ever be in those windows. And so where do people spend money into is a key question. You're going to have a return to some old-fashioned mercantilist policymaking, maybe, where there's a desire to make things at home and not trade as much. And, the free traders will have an economic argument against that. But it'll be really important to make sure that consumer spending is done in communities. And that might, there aren't going to be enough small businesses to sustain the local demand if we are successful in making sure the demand is local. So that's one element of policymaking that we're going to have to get ahead of. One idea I'll use this podcast to propose two ideas to the Ontario government. One on the cost deferral side and one on the stimulus side. On the cost deferral side, one of the third or fourth highest payments for many families is auto insurance, and governments have powers under the Insurance Act and in collaboration with the insurance industry to provide more relief from those payments than I've seen. We've heard a lot about rent. We've heard a lot about electricity and gas. And property taxes, but we actually haven't heard anything on the auto insurance side, and that's a major expense, and that's a mandated product by the province, and the province can have tools to attend to that. The other piece on the stimulus side is I hope the province is considering, and again they can borrow cheaply and not record this as a debt necessarily on their books. Where's the Ontario-focused small business lender? We know that the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is a strong institution, is not as present in Ontario as Ontario's population would suggest. There's a real opportunity here. We know that a lot of small businesses are averse to entering the financial system in general, where they run on a cash basis. They don't want to take on too much debt. Maybe they don't have relationships with their small business lenders in their communities. So maybe we need, as a time-limited measure, and maybe the banks themselves can capitalize this, help capitalize this. Can we get a small business lender going for new businesses that we'll have to recreate once we're in an era of a stimulus?
Yeah, well, I think they're both great points. And I mean, the title of the podcast is Intended Consequences, on the basis that it's supposed to be about policy topics that actually achieve the goals that they're supposed to achieve. So you're in the right place suggesting policy solutions here. But I think, your point on making things at home again and having a priority on more of like a nationalist scale, the types of things that we try to procure and produce and purchase. I mean, I remember back in the 2008 recession, there was a pretty big movement of cars having stickers on them that said "Made in Ontario" or "Made at the Windsor plant" or that sort of thing, so that people had a little bit of pride and they knew that money was going back into their own economies. So I can kind of skip ahead here on a question for you, but given that the potential for more of a protectionist is supporting us at home, do you think that there's a bit of a deficit that'll come in the way of trust, in the way of government institutions and potentially other countries or international organizations sort of stemming from this whole thing?
I hope in Canada, signs are good for that. Signs are relatively good for that in Canada, but you and I are talking on March the 30th. Mm-hmm. And all indications are that the systems that are really going to get pressured are going to be in April. And so that comes back to what we talked about at the outset of this podcast, which is the need for clear, decisive, but with an element of humility, communication, and preparation for some of that. I think you're going to see if the healthcare system can't, I think the healthcare system will generally be a leading indicator for this. If the healthcare systems delivers, and all the aspects of it deliver in a way that in general preserve trust, there'll be some downstream understanding of there'll be some downstream preservation of trust in institutions. I would add, though, that the other thing, and I'm sure something that is really bugging policymakers, and you could see it bugged both Premier Ford and Prime Minister Trudeau at different times in their press conferences over the last few days. If the benefits are used opportunistically, if there's price gouging, if there's front of the line treatment for some and not others, those are the things that really kill trust, and those could be individual stories that get traction. So people need to have an experience. People need to have an experience, even in this desperate time, that there's an element of fairness. And my guess is, and I want to hear from you on this for sure as well, is my guess is if we can preserve that overall sense, and the fundamental systems get us through to the other side, even if lots of people suffer along the way, even those people who suffer will not necessarily lose trust. There's one other element though, which is the global reckoning of how this got so bad so fast in so many places, and that's going to result in a that's going to result in a decline of trust. Tyler Cowen on his blog Marginal Revolution has a good little blog post today about who the winners and losers are going to be, and at the very top of losers are Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization in his quick estimation.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're seeing more and more of that as the days go on, as more questions are being asked, and there's not necessarily answers for them, which just creates a problem in and of itself. But on the fairness part with government, I mean, I think that's especially in Ontario, a very real statement. I think one of the things that Premier Ford sort of prides himself on is his ability to be for every Ontarian. He likes to talk about the little guy on a very regular basis, and having that sort of sense of being in touch with a common person. If he's going to create policies that do not reflect that, it's going to have a real and a lasting problem. So I couldn't agree more that fairness needs to be felt. And I think the other part that I would add to that conversation is a geographic level of fairness as well. There's a real potential that, yes, small businesses are going to be heard across the province and restaurants are going to be heard across the province. But to use my example of Oro-Medonte, I mean, I can think of 3 restaurants in my hometown total. It's a town of 21,000 people. So if 50% of small businesses or restaurants don't come back from this, that's going to have a much bigger difference than a city like Toronto that has thousands of restaurants. So just knowing that impact to rural or northern communities, or even just towns that are a little bit smaller than, say, the GTA will have a big implication as well, and being able to spread that benefit. I think we're already seeing certain hospitals have shortages of equipment, personal protective equipment, and that kind of stuff you got to jump on quickly in order to ensure that people feel protected no matter what part of the province they're in. And I think you rightly said, April looks like it's going to be a challenging month. May and June could also be challenging, even more so. And so that pressure is going to amplify over and over again. So we are approaching the end of the podcast. I have a couple of questions left for you, because I do want to ask, you recently wrote an op-ed where you kind of had 3 steps. And I think we've kind of talked about the steps a little bit here, where you said money first, then let's talk about traditional stimulus, and then let's adapt to what the new economy is. And we've kind of been going through those in this conversation, but we haven't talked as much about the new economy. So on step 3, on that adapting to the new economy, let me kind of phrase it this way. If the premier or the finance minister or the prime minister, and obviously it could be different who it is, but if they called you today and they said, Karim, what's your biggest concern about a lasting implication as a result of COVID-19? How do you kind of answer that question? What do you think is out there that people aren't really thinking about that could last, change, or alter the way that we deal with society and the economy as we know it?
In short, there's 2 that I'm concerned about. One is an exacerbation of inequality. The second is a lack of progress in developing human capital. Online education is great, but we're not really doing online education right now. We're doing remote learning as a substitute for the learning that was already happening. And it's not a perfect substitute in any way, and it has inequality effects. Those who have less access to a whole range of resources and privileges are going to be left further behind in their education, even if we're lucky and the distancing only goes till May, June, and then we're back at school in September. So I'm really worried about those are 2 things that really need to be attended to, and they're things that can start to be attended to in the kind of the economic rebirth side of things. So those are they can be attended to by choosing appropriate levels of taxation, of making sure that everyone did their fair share as part of this process, and in ensuring that we have some pro-innovation, pro-growth policies going forward. And there's going to be some policy, there's going to be at least 3 ideas that are going to automatically be more shiny than they were before the crisis. One is a universal basic income. Second is online education. And third is more action on climate change. And without being too triumphalist about any of those, I would hope that policymakers take those 3 ideas seriously, and each of those ideas can be developed through really innovative policy in ways that enhance human capital and reduce inequality. So those would be a few things I would have in mind. I don't have the prescription yet. With the Brookfield Institute and Matthew Mendelson, the Ryerson Leadership Lab is collaborating on a project called First Policy Response. We'll be launching that in a couple of days, which is really meant to gather all the ideas and do original publishing of some of the things that we're going to need to do, not only now, but in the near future. And I hope that some of those ideas we start to test. I also hope that we have some new institution that comes together to be leading the response. Governments are, as you know, are imperfect. They've got rules, they've got responsibilities, they've got regulatory responsibilities, and private sector institutions are often imperfect. But you know that there are some entities that already exist in Ontario that do a pretty good job when given the right direction around building things or around leading economic development. In Ontario, we've got the Infrastructure Ontario. In Canada, we've got the hopefully to grow Canada Infrastructure Bank. So we may need a new institution that has an element of private and public to help lead the reconstruction. And to be attuned to some of those key shifts around human capital and inequality. That would be my take on it.
Well, it's a fascinating way to put it in a great thought piece, because I saw you on Twitter earlier today. I think someone mentioned, like, what are we going to call this thing, right? We had the Great Depression, we had the Great Recession. What do we call this? And the thought that I had, which I typed out and then deleted because I don't want it to be true, was the Great Regression, in the sense that we go backwards. And, the points you're making about, not investing properly in human capital and losing societal progress because we sort of stand still for 3, 4, 5 months or potentially longer, can have real implications. So I think that that's a really good way to put policymakers' sort of frame of thought, so that they can attack that problem properly. And whether it's creating new institutions, creating new program, it's probably some combination of all those things. But I think that's a really valuable takeaway. So we are running out of time. So I want to ask you, mentioned the policy response stuff, which is a great new initiative to collect some of these ideas. But you've also got the Ryerson Leadership Lab, which you run and co-founded. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing at the Ryerson Leadership Lab, what you're up to now, and how this has changed sort of your work plan and what life is like for you in the new COVID reality.
For sure. And life for me, and like many others, is, and the lucky ones who are salaried and have basements, is still managing around a spouse's, my wife's busy schedule, and kids who need entertainment and education. So that is a reality for many of us. We started the Ryerson Leadership Lab as an action-oriented think tank working at the intersection of leadership and public policy, really around the insights that leadership development needed public policy insights, and public policy without leadership was inert and not going to thrive. And so we have been running for about 2.5 years, developing our policy agenda, our leadership development agenda, and a pretty busy events agenda. And now we're rethinking what we do. And we've pivoted quickly towards creating online convening spaces that connect people with power or with insights with people who don't think they have that power and insights, or are hungry for those insights. So we're trying to connect a kind of a younger community with a policy maker community with a more executive community around some key issue areas that we care about. And we're kind of ended up being accidentally active in the online education space. So we developed a documentary, which Mitch, you appeared in, as you remember, on OSAP reform, and an online learning tool around that. We're continuing to develop our research around healthy public spaces and healthy public squares, an online public square, the online space where we practice our democracy. We have a research agenda around that, and that feels more important now. And then we've launched this First Policy Response. So we're really trying to be a nimble think tank that is responsive to people and constituents that some policymakers just wouldn't be spending as much time with. That's our aspiration, and we are still figuring it out, as any entity thinks it knows what it's got to do in the next few months, unless they're online providers. And and any thinking institution really has to continue to think hard and test its ideas out in public to see how its work is going to be essential in this new reality.
Well, the answer does two things for me. It shows me, one, how widespread the impact of this thing is, that it's hitting every single business and organization down to university think tanks in the province of Ontario. And the second is it shows how important some of the work you're doing is, and continuing to do that and think of it in a new way, or accelerate some of the thinking that you had done before to respond to this challenge is really important. I think it's odd to say that thinkers are maybe required now more than ever, and they'll be translated into action soon enough. So it's important to continue to feed that discourse so that we can get the right ideas and the right solutions, and put forward both a Canadian and an Ontarian perspective that work for people to get us out of this. So as we conclude here, Karim, I just wanted to say thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's really insightful. It's obviously well thought out, and it's the type of stuff that I hope policymakers, both in the civil service, on the political side, and in the private sector, get a chance to listen to, so that they can take away some interesting new perspectives on how to deal with COVID-19, both in the province and in the country more generally. So appreciate you coming on the program.
Thanks so much, Mitch. We have so much to thank for our healthcare workers and any frontline worker, and I hope that the things that this kind of conversation does, following up on their essential work, can be really additive. So thank you so much for a thoughtful conversation.
Appreciate it, and a great point. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.